Apparently, when I was 3, I could recite a poem. My dad taught me. It was by Carl Sandburg. Fog. The fog comes on little cat feet. It sits looking over harbor and city on silent haunches and then moves on. I don't remember learning it, and I don't remember saying it, and I don't even remember it correctly. I misremembered it. I always have said to myself in the 53 years since then, the fog comes in on little cat feet, which is incorrect. It goes, the fog comes on little cat feet. The way I remembered it is a nursery rhyme. The fog comes in on little cat feet. I was 3. If I did this for the family, for company, just to get that look on my father's face, I don't recall. But you know how there are always old people sitting around who are just waiting for the chance to recite all the old poems that they learned when they were young? I am one of those people. They sit there, and then something happens, and they get to say, backward, turn backward, O time in your flight. Make me a child again just for one night. Under the spreading chestnut tree, the village smithy stands. And they want to go on and on and on. They can't find their glasses, they can't find their car keys, but they can recite 50, 100 lines of Longfellow. That's me. And I'm so glad we're here together because I get to do it, because I don't get to do it any other time. When I was in 3rd grade, 2nd grade and 3rd grade, I was surrounded by old people. My parents were old, my teachers were old, everyone around me was old. I was young and they were old. And their project, it seemed, was to make me old like them. And the way they went about it was to have me memorize and recite the old poems that they, who are now old, knew when they were young. So there was not a thought that I should explore contemporary poetry. The thought was that I should recapitulate the old poems that the old people around me learned when they were young. My teacher in 2nd grade was Mrs. Clark, and we sat in rows, and every Friday, every student recited 8 lines of poetry. My teacher in 3rd grade was Ms. Bogan, and we sat in rows, and every Friday, every student recited 8 lines of poetry, which meant that every Monday, every student had to go home and say to their family, I need 8 lines by Friday. What have you got? In my case, it meant that my father, who was old and who was from Indiana, could bring me the gift of James Whitcomb Riley, the Hoosier Bard, who was very, very, very famous in 1900. And so my dad had me memorizing these poems by James Whitcomb Riley, the Hoosier Bard. Oh, the raggedy man, he works for Pa, and he's the goodest man you ever saw. He comes to our house every day and waters the horses and feeds them hay. Ain't he an awful fine raggedy man? Raggedy, raggedy, raggedy man. That's James Whitcomb Riley, and I was great at it. My mom would not be called Edwardian by anyone who knew her, but she was from English-speaking Montreal, and she was very old, and she was raised by Edwardians. And so when it was her turn to help me find and memorize a poem, really? 3rd grade? A little dress? My knees knocking? The wind was a torrent of darkness among the gusty trees. The moon was a ghostly galleon tossed among cloudy seas. The road was a ribbon of moonlight over the purple moor, and the highwaymen came riding, riding, riding. The highwaymen came riding up to the old inn door. He'd a French cocked hat on his forehead, a bunch of lace at his chin, a coat of the clary velvet, and breeches of brown doe skin. They fitted with never a wrinkle. His boots were up to his thigh, and the highwaymen came riding, riding, riding. the highwayman came riding up to the old inn door. I learned every word of the first part. It gets kind of lurid after that, so I didn't follow it through. But every week, for what must have been 10 weeks, I recited 8 lines of The Highwayman, which was written in 1906, when I was in 3rd grade in 1969. And I'm sure even Miss Bogan thought, really, The Highwayman? James Whitcomb Riley? Who are your parents? They must be so old. While I was up there reciting, was she thinking about herself when she was young, which must have been 100 years ago? Was she remembering her own family, helping her learn their poems? This was standard educational practice from about 1850 until about 1930. The memorization of poetry is what we did in school. That it continued in my life until the 1960s is a little weird, but it has produced me and my ability to recite all these very, very old poems whenever anyone asks, which they never do until today. There's a very good book about this, about the pedagogy of forced rote memorization in American and British education, called By Heart by Catherine Robson. And the term that she uses, which I get because I lived it, is recapitulation. My generation recited the poems of the previous generation. That made their project be to turn me into themselves. And school affirmed that project. And as more and more different kinds of people became educated between 1850 and 1930, the thought was very firmly in place that what those new learners need to do is learn poetry. And by learning poetry, I don't mean understand, analyze, disassemble, reflect, notice themes, different ways of phrasing, prosody. I mean learn, like know. Like, how will I know that you have learned the poem? Because you will know it. How will I know that you know it? Because you will say it. Do you have to understand it? No. That wasn't part of it at all. Now, a great shift happened in education. And it happened in my little 3rd grade body. In June of 3rd grade, I was reciting and reciting and reciting. And then there was the summer, and during that summer, which was the summer of '69, everything changed. I was not aware of it at the time because I was out in the backyard playing with Julia. But when it happened, I came back to school in September 1969 and said, all right, let's get to work. And they said, here's a blank piece of paper. And I said, what am I supposed to do? You're supposed to write the poem. Really? Okay. So I started writing poems. I was no longer a container. I was a creator. And I was even better at that. And I was so good at it because I had so much what poetry is in my mind already. I was cranking them out. I could write them in real time. Give me a topic, I'll set the meter, I'll set the rhyme, and I'm just passing them out. I could just do this all day long. I was so good. I can't remember any of them. I can't remember what they were about. I can't remember how they sounded. I can't remember a single thing. And I'm sure my parents thought, huh, it never occurred to anyone in my pre-1969 life that school children should write poems, but it never occurred to anyone in my post-1969 life that school children should memorize poems. What had been the ideal, the most perfect expression of our shared culture, which is a classroom of students all standing at attention, reciting the same poem at the same time together. Can you imagine anything more oppressive of our little spirits? Rote learning, forced memorization without any comprehension. It was so in, and then it became so out. It happened gradually to everyone else, and suddenly to me. So when my 10th grade son came home and said, I have to learn the prologue to Romeo and Juliet and recite it in class, I thought, oh, goody. Why is that? Because what I inherited, I can now bequeath to you. The time for recapitulation has come. And what it is that I inherited is cultural capital. And I will grant it to you. And we'll sit down together. And I'll show you how all the rhyme scheme works and everything like that. And we'll learn it together. This is going to be great. Now, can you memorize something without understanding it? It turns out you can. Yes. Yeah. I still remember it. He got through it. But I still remember. 2 households, both alike. No, okay. When I was in high school, we were all analyzing, never writing and never memorizing. When I was in 12th grade, we did a production of As You Like It, and I was Rosalind, and I was up to my eyeballs in Shakespeare. I had to memorize so much Shakespeare. Rosalind is a tall girl who runs her mouth, and she's just up there talking Shakespeare, 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 the whole play. I remember sitting in study hall, memorizing and memorizing and memorizing all these lines. And the guy who was Touchstone, the jester, Derek, was so funny that nobody even knew I was in the play. So Monday morning, I'm kind of walking down the halls, I was the lead, and they say, oh, weren't you in that play about that funny guy? Said, I'd rather bear with you than bear you. Ah, it was so funny. That was my play. But nobody remembers me. They only remember him. And I don't even remember myself, but I remember him. The key to living in an oral world is to do memorable things and think memorable thoughts. And me memorizing Shakespeare was not memorable enough for anyone to remember, and I have since forgotten the entire thing. When I was in college, my first-year professor got a little carried away, and we really did not know how to speak Italian. That's why we were in that class. And he had us memorize a poem from 1880 by Joshua Carducci. Lenta fiocca la neve del cielo cenario, gridi, suoni di vita più non salgono dalla città. Now, I learned Italian. I speak Italian. I know Italian. I have no idea what that poem is about. I didn't then. I still don't. But I can still say the whole thing. What seems to happen is that there's a kind of thinking we're doing when we're learning how to do something, and a kind of thinking we're doing when we know how to do something. I'm teaching myself piano, don't ask, and it's just going horribly. I'm just so bad at it. I've been doing it for years. It's just agony to me because it's so hard. And smoke is coming out of my ears. And then every once in a while, like, okay, it's happened twice, there's a little phrase that I can do, and I can play it, and it just happens, and I can physically feel it going from one part of my brain to another part of my brain. And people who don't know much about neuroanatomy, like me, think of the brain as a left brain, right brain thing, and the right brain is cool, and the left brain is nerdy, and what I'm now finding out, that it's the sagittal axis. I've been to the library. It's the front and back. That's the movement that I'm interested in now. Your front brain is your working it out. You're studying your analyzing brain. And your back brain is your knowing brain. So an older dancer is teaching a younger dancer the steps, and she watches it very critically and says, she's still thinking. And a diver is about to go onto the platform for her final dive, and they're interviewing her, and she says, I'm just going to get out there and dive stupid. By which she means, I'm not going to think about it too much. Choking is bringing your front brain into play when you should be relying on your back brain. Your cerebral brain needs to just hush itself down, and all the power needs to come to your back brain, to your cerebellum, the home of the known. So when we're memorizing something, we're not only taking it in through our eyeballs and hearing it through our ears, we're moving it from our thinking brain back to our knowing brain. And so what do we have when we have a memorized poem? We have someone else's ratiocination, someone else's analysis, intellection, craft, thought, care, that becomes our automaticity. When I was ready to recite Fog, my father didn't say, now remember, sweetie, this one starts with an unvoiced labiodental fricative. So be sure to have your lower lip touching your teeth so that the air can come out the sides when you go. That wasn't part of it. I stood up, I opened my mouth, and out came Fog. So when the actor is standing and looking at Juliet, and she's so pretty, he isn't saying, now if I start this line with two trochees, I'll have an unstressed syllable on the subjunctive, or he just opens his mouth and he thinks about her and he says, oh, that I were a glove upon that hand. And it comes out perfect. Adults are too much up here and not enough back here. Now, let me just say this. Middle schoolers are too much back here and not enough up here. I want my students to be thinkers. The life work of my career, 26 years, has been to get people to think more, not less. I'm not opposed to thinking. But if empathy is our highest human purpose, what more empathic experience could I possibly have than to take someone else's thinking and turn it into my knowing? Thank you very much.